Hi class, today we're going to talk about psychological disorders. How do we decide whether or not something is a psychological disorder? When trying to decide whether a behavior or a mental process or an emotion is considered a psychological disorder, we must consider the 4 Ds. The first D is deviance. Is something severely out of the ordinary? However, everything that is deviant is not considered a disorder. For example, it's deviant to be a billionaire. However, no one would say that having lots of money means that a person has a psychological disorder. The next thing that we consider is distress. Does the behavior or way of thinking or emotion cause significant distress for the person experiencing it or for the people in their environment? The third D is dysfunction. Does it cause dysfunction for the person in terms of them being able to carry out their day-to-day lives? And lastly is danger. Is the behavior or way of thinking or emotion, does it cause danger to the person or to the people in their environment? So in deciding whether something is a psychological disorder, we consider deviance, distress, dysfunction, and danger. The history of treating psychological disorders is thought to go all the way back to prehistoric men. Skulls have been found with small holes drilled in them. The drilling of these holes is a process known as trepanning. It is thought that trepanning was done in order to allow evil spirits to leave the brain, thus treating psychological disorders. The understanding of psychological disorders have taken many forms throughout the years, from Hippocrates in ancient Greece, thinking that psychological disorders was caused by the imbalance of bodily fluids, to psychological disorders being treated as witchcraft. The current understanding of psychological disorders is based on the medical model. Basically, there is something that is an abnormal brain structure or abnormal chemicals within the brain. It's one of the things that can cause psychological disorders. This is called the medical model. Remember the biopsychosocial approach? The biopsychosocial approach basically says that who we are as individuals is a combination of what's going on inside of our bodies, our genes, it's a combination of our environment, and it's a combination of personal factors. When understanding psychological disorders that approach the understanding from the biopsychosocial approach also says that understanding disorders can be caused by things happening within the brain. Disorders can be caused by environmental influences, and disorders can be caused by a person's own understanding of the world, their own perceptions and way to perceive things. So this is another way of understanding psychological disorders. Here's some more information about the biopsychosocial support. Again, genetic predisposition, psychological dynamics, and social and cultural circumstances all interact to contribute to psychological disorders. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders is a book that helps us to understand how to classify psychological disorders and how to treat them. The book gives us statistics, helps us to understand what to look for in terms of symptoms, and also talks about the things that causes psychological disorders. So it's a very good guide for understanding and labeling psychological disorders. The problem is that this book is constructed by scientists that live in the current world. And our understanding of what is a psychological disorder is very greatly influenced by society and what society thinks is correct behavior. An example of this is up until 1970s, homosexual behavior was considered a psychological disorder. It wasn't until 1970s that was removed. So our understanding led us to understand that homosexual behavior is not something that should be classified as a psychological disorder. Before that, if slaves wanted to escape from freedom, that was considered a psychological disorder. So our psychological disorder is very much influenced by our time and by society. Also, as society changes, new things are added into the DSM. For example, 20 years ago, there was no such thing as a gaming addiction. 20 years ago, there was no such thing as caffeine addiction. However, those things do need to be considered in realm of what's going on currently in our society. And here's some more information concerning the DSM. I've already talked about a little bit the DSM and some of the criticism that comes along with the DSM. Another thing that I want to chat about for a minute is labeling. Psychological disorders still carry negative connotations in our society. So being diagnosed with a psychological disorder can interfere with things like the ability to get a certain job. It can influence things like how much you pay for your insurance, etc. So because psychological disorders carry negative stigma, we have to be very careful in terms of labeling someone as having a psychological disorders. And as such, people who are experiencing symptoms or problems sometimes avoid getting help because they understand the stigma that having a psychological disorders puts on people in society. ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, is a commonly diagnosed disorder of childhood. The key symptom for ADHD is the inability to focus or maintain sustained attention. There's a lot of criticism about ADHD. The biggest criticism is that it's considered to be overdiagnosed. Other criticism is in the next slide, but just pay attention to the fact that it could be that it's overdiagnosed. It also could be that now that we're more aware of it, therefore it's more diagnosed. There's a lot of debate out there about whether or not ADHD is overdiagnosed. Here is some more information on ADHD. One of the interesting ideas is that people with psychological disorders are dangerous. Statistically speaking, people with psychological disorders are no more dangerous than anyone else in the general public. Indeed, people with psychological disorders are more likely to be of danger to themselves than to anyone else. So this idea that someone with psychological disorders is dangerous is a falsehood. How common are psychological disorders? Very common. About 1 in 4 Americans will be diagnosed with a psychological disorders. And most of these psychological disorders are highly treatable. It's very common. The good thing, though, is that there are treatments out there for psychological disorders. What contributes to psychological disorders? There's a lot of things. Environmental influences, such as high-stress environments. Poverty is certainly an influence. Access to mental health care, access to social support systems. All of these things contribute to rates of psychological disorders. This slide just shows you the median ages at which particular psychological disorders appear. This slide shows you some risk factors, some things that put you at risk for developing a psychological disorder. It also shows you some protective factors, some things that can give you a little extra protection against developing a psychological disorder. Please note that aerobic exercise is up there as one of the protective factors that will keep us from developing a psychological disorder. So again, exercise is the gift that just keeps giving. And that's it for the first lecture in psychological disorders. In the next lecture, I'll be talking about mood disorders, which include anxiety, depression, OCD, and other mood disorders.